Thank you, sir, for such an enlightening and thought-provoking session. It is an honor to introduce Honorable Professor Bradul Alam, sir, former head of the Department of the Political Science at Jamia Millia Islamia University, New Delhi. A distinguished academic, he holds MA, MPhil, and PhD degree from Utkal University, JNU, and Cornell University. Sir has authored 5 books, edited 1 volume, and contributed to over 60 scholarly publications. Sir has received prestigious fellowship from Fulbright DAAD and Shastri Canadian Foreign Ministry. A renowned commentator on international affairs, his insights are valued across media platforms in India and abroad. Today, Sir will be sharing his expertise on India-Japan relation, challenges and opportunities. We eagerly look forward to his valuable insights. Let's welcome him with a big round of applause.
A very warm good afternoon to all of you. First of all, I'd like to record my deep sense of gratitude and appreciation to Sri I.P. Agrawalji, Professor Lalit Agarwal, Dr. Ramakant Dwivedi, under whose brainchild this very important MERI 5.0 dialogue series is taking place. Ambassador Skantayal, Ambassador Ashok Sharma, distinguished academics, my colleagues, Professor Srikant Kondapalli and Professor Jitendra Uttam, students and research scholars. Today I will be talking about India, Japan. Actually, when I was in JNU, I did not have any idea about Japan except that it's a very colorful country, very fancy country. So we used to talk about sayonara, all those things. And then I went to US. But as it happened, I spent as a visiting professor in Japan for about completely 8 years. So during that time, I taught a number of courses on Japan, India, Japan, US, Japan in the Asia Pacific, etc., etc. So I will try to devote my times looking at Delhi from Tokyo and also looking at Tokyo from Delhi and trying to make some sense out of it. Since we are all students of international politics, international relations in some ways, what I would like to do is at the beginning, trying to situate and contextualize the relationship or at least the foreign policy decision making within the context of mainstream IR theories that we all are very aware of and we read that very often. The realist theory, for example, they talk about power, national interest, survival, etc., etc. I think if you look at both India and Japan, I think they look into that, and that has been described by Hans Morgenthau, Kenneth Walls, John Mearsheimer, Henry Kissinger, etc. Then we move on to neo-realist theory, Joseph Nye, Robert Keohane, number of other scholars. They talk about all the things that the realists talk about, but they also go a step further that cooperation and conflict, they are not necessarily contradictory. Both the things can go in parallel and both the things can continue in terms of interstate relations, in terms of bilateral relations. And also, even if you have power, national interest, survival, etc., how about self-help? How about you can survive and navigate in an anarchic society that Hedley Bull talks about? So capabilities are also equally important. Then there is another theory that came in the 90s by Peter Kudzinstein, Alexander Wendt, and they talk about constructivist theory, that just power, national interest, survival, they are adequate, but they are not sufficiently adequate. So we need to talk about ideas or ideational nature. We talk about norms, the cultural norms, and the way they behave, the social constructions, etc. Then we have theories like Harvard's Graham Allison in Essence of Decision, the rational actor theories, that whatever decision making is being made, particularly among democratic societies or in a plural societies, are the rational, are the actors that formulate those policies either in concert with other stakeholders. Is it a rational decision or is it a non-rational or irrational decisions? So I think if you look at a broad trajectory of India-Japan relations in the last 70, 80 years since at the end of World War II, I think we see a broad spectrum and a judicious mix of all the combination of all the mainstream IR theories. The next what I would like to talk about is how to put the relationship within a polarity debate. Like at the end of World War II in 1945, the United States of America, it enjoyed unipolar status for about 4.5 years, till 1949, when then Soviet Union, they also exploded the nuclear device. And since 49 to roughly 1989 or 1990, about 41 years, it was basically a bipolar world. They did not come face to face with each other except in Cuban Missile Crisis or Soviet Union, in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc. It was mostly in a proxy levels. Since 1990, at the end of Cold War, the way we all knew about Soviet Union, it was gone. It was splintered into different republics. And then it's also the era of globalization, privatization, liberalizations. And in 1990 onwards, again it became a unipolar world with, again, United States, the Uncle Sam at the helm. And that continued roughly for about a decade till the beginning of 21st century, 2000, when it becomes a multipolar world. That USA is important, but there are also other multiple centers of power. They are also exerting very important positions in different parts of the world, including China, including Japan, and many other countries in the world. Then I think around 2010 onwards, a scholar, Amitabh Acharya, he talked about that multipolar world has also given birth to a new one called multiplex world, in which the Western dominance is there, if not hegemony. But again, the global South has also acquired a new dimension. So you cannot wishy-washy the role and the clout of the global South, which is a big power to reckon with. And last couple of years, there is a new theory which I read, a scholar called Joseph Joffe from Johns Hopkins University in Washington. He says the world since the end of during this Ukrainian crisis, etc., now it is coming into a 2.5 world. And what Joffe talks about 2.5 world means, it is US, China, China, US at the global scene, with Russia like a half power, piggybacking. I mean, you can, if you want to personify, like Xi Jinping piggybacking behind, Putin piggybacking behind Xi Jinping. So I think there can be a lot of debates about that. Also, I think in terms of institutional orders, if you see in the last 50, 60, 70 years, I mean, we talk about bilateralism, minilateralism, plurilateralisms, we talk about Quad, we talk about AUKUS, we talk about Squad, we talk about I2U2, and we also talk about multilateral bodies, BRICS, SCO, and many other bodies, for example. So I think over a period of time, both India and Japan, they tried to manage and also maintain their own particular turf and power quotient. At the same time, they like to expand the net of influence or the spheres of influence. So the third part of my presentation will be, I think if you look at Japan per se, how Japan has moved ahead at the end of World War II when it was a defeated nation. The emperor had to sign the surrender ceremony. Douglas MacArthur, he took over literally. Japan had a new constitution. I think the period from in the 1950s, Yoshida became the prime minister. He came up with a Yoshida doctrine, which is mostly a pacific diplomacy. That will, instead of becoming a risk taker, we would rather prefer to be a risk averse nations and trying to put eggs rather all in economic baskets. And then you saw in the 50s and 60s, the Shinkansen Express, the so-called bullet trains, Sumitomo, Mitsubishi, Toyota, all of those things. So that was the period of 50s and 60s. So Yoshida doctrine basically talked about Pacific diplomacy. In the 70s, Fukuda doctrine, they talk about goodwill diplomacy. And in the 70s also how we can, because there is an oil crisis in the Middle East and how that might affect Japan, because Japan doesn't have sufficient raw materials, so they have to rely on good faith of all those West Asian countries. So that was basically 70s was a goodwill diplomacy. In the 1990s, the Kaifu doctrine, when Toshiki Kaifu became the prime minister, he says that the time has come when we need to do some rebalancing diplomacy, or I would say long durée diplomacy. That was the time when there was a debate that Japan needs to get out of the closet and try to be a full member of the society. Then in the 1990s time, when the first Persian Gulf War took place, a lot of people blamed Japan, that Japan is basically pursuing a checkbook diplomacy. meaning basically writing the checks, but without putting any sweat, any blood, or any manpower. In the Persian Gulf or the other countries, Operation Desert Storm, they are paying for that. And that was the time when Ozawa came out with a book called The Blueprint for a New Japan. So Japan, and that debate is always there, is Japan, quote unquote, a normal country? So we can split into pre-normal, normal, and post-normal, and how you define normal, how normal is normal, in spite of Article 9, STF, etc., etc. So that was, then 2000, Yoshiro Mori spent about an hour, year or two, then Junichiro Koizumi, when I was there, Mori and Koizumi, both of them there as prime ministers. I think that was the time when they said, I think it is important that on the top of de-risking and decoupling, what we need to do is strategic diplomacy. Because that was the time of the Iraq War of 2003. That was also the time of 9/11, September 1. So we need to be a part, we need to be an integral partner of global war on terror. So I think that continued, so basically in 2000. Then I think Shinzo Abe 1 and Shinzo Abe 2, because he was there at different times in the first decade and also in the second decade. What I would like to say is, during his time, he basically talked about, let us have a more proactive diplomacy, more reciprocal diplomacy, and he also tried to do both, if I can use the word, wholesale diplomacy and also retail diplomacy with individual countries when cultivating. Including India, he made a visit in the parliament. He said the arc of freedom and prosperities, and also that was the beginning of the Indo-Pacific doctrine, etc. And I think after that, I think in the last couple of years, we see Fumio Kishida and currently Shigeru Ishiba. They say that this is the time that we need to come out of the closet, and I think we need to do what I'd say competitive diplomacy. So I think, and at the same time, trying to maintain the national interest. If America under Trump too is going to talk about MAGA, make America great again, and India can talk about MIGA, make India great again, why not MJGA, make Japan great again? So I think we should not, Japan should not be shy of doing it, and wherever it is possible, trying to play the role of a partner, role of a co-facilitator, etc., etc. I think in some ways you can say the policy of hedging diplomacy that Ishiba and the one that followed, Fumio Kishida followed. I think if you look at all of these policies, I think a lot of times, I mean, I spent 8 years is a reasonably a long time in Japan. I think a lot of the things has to do with these cultural nuances that I think a lot of people probably don't know. Because, I mean, when I spent longer time in US, I mean, if you just say somebody morning, so they understand this is good morning. So I think in Japan, you have to say, Ohayo gozaimasu. So, hello, sir. I mean, with a lot of respect. So, I mean, you cannot just say Srikant. I mean, I remember when I used to call my professor, Ben Gins, Peter Kardjinstan. Hi, Peter, how are you doing? So, I mean, that's the way. It's very informal, but Japan culture is very much embedded into a very structured kind of thing, in a very cultural events thing. Maybe it has something to do long before, like 1600 to 1868, 250 plus years, the Tokugawa period, I think Tokugawa is gone, the Meiji period came, that is gone. Japan became a new country after the World War II. But I think a lot of those cultural nuances come along. So like if I have to address Srikant Kondapalli, Srikant-san, Kondapalli sensei, Professor Lalit-san, Agrawal sensei. So I think it's a very formal one. Arigato, it means thank you. But you have to say arigato gozaimasu, ohayo gozaimasu. I remember by mistake, somebody said good morning at 5 minutes past 10 o'clock. He said, oh, didn't you look at your watch? I mean, this is past 10 o'clock. Exactly at 10 o'clock, you have to say konnichiwa. And exactly at 6 p.m. in the evening, you have to say kanbanwa. So they are very, very structured in that way. So I think in foreign policy also, a lot of times, they are very smart people, very intelligent people. Sometimes I feel that it's like a 2 step forward and 1 step back, or 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, because of the history and trying to understand, trying to read what the other person thinks about. So I think a lot of those nuances, I think that needs to be taken care of. Having said that, I would just like to quickly go over some of the broad overview of Japan's relations with India. I think in the inaugural remarks, Mr. Agrawal talked about the cultural connections, the Buddhist connections, and how at the end of World War II, India provided very generous iron ores and other mineral resources to Japan. Nehru visited Japan in 49. India entered a peace treaty with Japan and entered the diplomatic relations on 28 April 52. Since then, I think number of Indian prime ministers they visited in the last 30-40 years. Festival of Japan took place in India in a very big way in 2007 when Dr. Manmohan Singh was here. Year of friendship in India in 2012. Diplomatic relations of 60 years. Bilateral cooperation has taken place in various multidimensional ways, from energy security, climate change, disaster management, Great East Asia earthquake of 2011, cultural, academic, people-to-people level, easing of passion. I think this is an ongoing process that has taken place. Japan's economic dimensions, I think two things everybody remembers, particularly ODA and JICA. ODA stands for Official Development Assistance. The very metro that we are so proud of in Delhi, this is funded by under ODA. There are a lot of the polio eradication program, forestation program in Karnataka, IIT Hyderabad, dedicated freight corridor, DFC project, Delhi Mumbai industrial corridor project, Mumbai Ahmedabad bullet trains, which is the smart city project. And Japan in the last couple of years under Modi 1, Modi 2 and now Modi 3, they have also shown interest to invest in a very liberal way in Make in India, Skills India, Digital India, Smart City Project, Viksit Bharat, etc., etc. So I think if you see that way, I mean, it's not like a quantum leap forward, but definitely it is a step in the right directions. Japan has also entered into strategic cooperations like Malabar exercise, the Coast Guard exercises, etc., etc. Japan also takes advantage of India's soft power. Like when I was in Japan, I remember the first time I was in Tokyo, there are hardly 5 or 6 Indian restaurants, Moti Mahal, Samrat, etc. But after a couple of years, I saw the number has multiplied like 20 or 30. Bollywood, music, literature, cuisine, textile, media, Gandhi, Tagore, India's diversity, non-violence, Ayurveda, yoga, I mean, you can name it. I just give you one personal examples. When I was teaching this course called Japan-India Relations in Japan International University, during one of the breaks, students asked me to show an Indian movie with Japanese subtitles. In literally every Japanese video stores, they have a section on Indian movies. And those days, there was a movie called Hum Dil De Chuke Sanam by Salman Khan and Aishwarya Rai. And it was called Mimora. So students were just crazy about, and one thing that remember, that particular year or the year before that, maybe 2000 or 2001, you know the movie Titanic. It was a box office hit all over the world. But the movie that was the bigger hit than Titanic in Japan was not Titanic by Leonardo DiCaprio or Kate Winslet. It was a movie by Rajinikanth. I was totally surprised. Rajinikanth is more popular than any actors that you can, everybody remembers Rajinikanth. And that movie, to my mind, it sounded very silly, but everybody, Japanese people, they loved it, called Odoru Maharaja, Dancing Maharaja. So the point I'm trying to make is India's soft power capabilities has also had a very positive impact in many different ways. You go to any libraries in Japan, you see the books of Rabindranath Tagore and how he influenced number of scholars from Japan, including Tenjin Okakura and many other people. India and Japan educational exchange programs, I think one of the things that our education minister Dharmendra Pradhan talks about is internationalization of India's programs. Now we have got IIT Delhi have a program in Abu Dhabi, in Tanzania. I think in the years to come, we'll see a number of Indian universities opening up campuses abroad and also vice versa. Kyoto University, Waseda, they are also showing interest to open up campuses over here. We also had relationship with Japan in terms of tsunami diplomacies that we got, because Japan is a very earthquake-prone country, so they have got all the advanced technologies, interdependence, interconnected Asian communities, and I think Sir talked about 21st century as an Asian century. So now the competition is who is number 1, number 2, and number 3 between these musical chairs, China, Japan, and India. So I think that needs to be resolved. And also emergence of nationalism, aging population, that's a very, very big issue because it affects the demography and also Japan as a nation in the next, in the intermediate term to the long term, etc., etc. A threat of WMD, bioterrorism, cybersecurity challenges. But one of the things, advantages that we have is our prime ministers, since Vajpayee years, in Manmohan Singh years, and also Prime Minister Narendra Modi, we have developed a good personal chemistry with Abe and with Fumio Ishida. I think that really helps to put things into big gear. Now we have got a 2+2 dialogues where our foreign minister and defense minister, they go to Japan on a regular basis. We have also the prime ministers of Japan coming to India on a regular basis and reciprocal return visits by India. So I think overall, I think if I make the story short, I think things are in the right trajectory, but as rightly said, in this changing power, geopolitical, geoeconomic, geostrategic churning, and particularly with Trump too coming, I think a lot of people are worried how things are going. Is he going to put the same kind of significance to Quad? Or he's going to basically leaving to these countries, Japan, Australia, India, to fend for yourself and you pay for it, just the way he has been asking the NATO people or the people in Paris climate change. And so I think it remains to be seen beyond the first proverbial political honeymoon days of 100 days, is Trump too going to behave just the way he's going to behave now, or he's going to change somewhat. So I think that remains to be changed. But I think overall, if you look strictly between India and Japan, they don't have any traditional adversarial issues. I think they manage well. I think there are a lot of cultural affinities between that, whether it is a Buddhist connection or Shintoism, etc. So I think I'm reasonably confident, reasonably hopeful that things will continue. But it is not that it is going to change a big diametrics. Japan, of course, enjoys the nuclear umbrella from US. There are a lot of people within Japan, they don't want that. There are elements within Okinawa, etc. There are some problems there. And Japan, how it deals with China, in spite of the fact of the textbook controversies, Yasukuni Shrine visits, number of other issues, Senkaku Islands, etc., etc. Professor Kondapalli is going to talk more about the India-China part. But Japan is an island country, basically Hokkaido, Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu. And then on the offshore, we have Okinawa. So it's a very small country, so they can't afford to have a hostile relations with Russia or with China or Korea. They have got abduction of Japanese nationals by North Korea, so they need to be very, very careful and about all those things. So again, thank you so much for inviting me. I appreciate it. Thank you.